Greetings, we are in room 303, Senior English A. I hope you have your hymnals open right now to page 462, 463, and following. We are going to turn now to the introductory comments of Unit 3. We are taking Level 1 bullet point notes, like we did with Unit 1 and Unit 2. And all we're doing is just summarizing as we read, okay? Every time we see some kind of heading, we're going to write that information down and try and put a couple of things underneath that heading in our own words. Notice that, first of all, Unit 3 has some dates. Do you see them on 463? Write those dates down. 1625 to 1798. Okay? Now, of course, Unit 2 was detailing the Renaissance, right? That great time of Shakespeare and all those other writers. We now turn to Unit 3. They call it a turbulent time. Let's write the word turbulent down. What this means is a time of tremendous confusion. And we are talking obviously about the 17th century. That's the years from 1600 to 1699. And the 18th century. That's the years 1700 to here, notice, 1798. John Milton's Areopagitica is quoted on page 463. Methinks I see in my mind a noble nation rousing itself like a strong man after sleep and shaking her invisible locks of hair, okay? It's an interesting word picture. Let's turn to page 464 and let's work through these pages now rather quickly. Snapshot of the period. And as I read, you read along with me. Social turmoil and new growth define this period in its literature. Let's write that down. Two things. Social turmoil, new growth define this period in its literature. The guns of the English Civil War, which pitted the king against Parliament, echo through the work of poets Andrew Marvell, Richard Lovelace, and John Milton. The industrial and agricultural revolutions sparked by the use of new machines in production and in farming led to the growth of cities, an increase in urban poverty, the rise of the middle class. These developments influenced the work of Samuel Pepys, Daniel Defoe, Samuel Johnson, Joseph Addison, each of whom chronicled the life of the middle class or catered to its leisure needs. At the end of the period, political revolutions in America and in France prepared the way for the revolution in literature known as Romanticism. Notice you've got some pictures there. You've also got some questions there at the bottom of 464. Notice that you've got some distinctions made between the Cavaliers versus the Roundheads. Notice for the Cavaliers, they are members of the aristocracy, the upper class. They have long flowing hair and wigs, elaborate clothes, plumed hats, self-consciously elegant pose, pro-Catholic and anti-Puritan, believed in divine right of kings. The Roundheads are almost the exact opposite. Social classes lower than the aristocracy, often middle class, lower class even. Short hair, plain dress, direct in manner, Puritan with strict religious beliefs, and they believed in limits to the king's rule. Notice as well, you've got an introduction of coffee. For those of you that are coffee drinkers, you'll enjoy looking at this drawing on 465 and the relationship between political order and the drinking of coffee. Let's now turn to the actual reading on 466 and following, the historical background, the 17th and 18th centuries, 1625 to 1798. Again, the dates, I hope you have those written down. Let's now read. We'll take a few notes as we go. The period begins with the beheading of one king and ends with the beheading of another, and in between a civil war and 5 revolutions which create a new and different world. Whoa, let's write all of that down. That's quite an amazing sentence. This period from 1625 to 1798 will begin with a king losing his head, end with a king losing his head, and in between you've got 5 different revolutions and along with a civil war. Let's talk about the Civil War first and the Restoration. A proud king, I hope you're reading with me, a proud king, Charles I, struggled with Parliament over political and religious authority until 1642, and in 1642, civil war broke out. The king's supporters were the Cavaliers, with long hair, plumed hats, high boots. The parliamentary forces were the Roundheads, with cropped hair, black hats, sturdy shoes. Their leaders included Oliver Cromwell, a stern general who thought his new model army could bring divine justice to England. After 6 brutal years, Charles was defeated, captured, tried by his subjects, condemned to death. He was beheaded in January 1649. A dead king does not, however, guarantee a democratic or effective government. Impatient with quarreling parliamentary factions, Cromwell seized power and served as Lord Protector of England until his death. Notice the years 1653 to 1658. In 1606, Charles II returned from exile in France and assumed the throne in a restored monarchy. When Charles died without an heir in 1685, his brother, a Catholic convert, became James II. James also had no male heirs, and his daughter Mary was a staunch Protestant. The uneasy country was willing to have James as a king while it waited for Mary, but the aging king had a son. Let's go to the Glorious Revolution. Nobles, merchants, other power brokers would not stand for a Catholic dynasty. In 1688, they invited Mary and her husband William to take the throne. James was disposed, and William and Mary succeeded him, an event hailed as, quote-unquote, the Glorious Revolution. The will of the governed had once again determined who would rule, but this time without great bloodshed. Top of page 467. Parliament stepped in again in 1701, passing the Act of Settlement to keep the crown in Protestant hands. In 1714, George, the Elector of Hanover in Germany, became king. George I did not speak English and cared little for the country, and Parliament assumed almost complete control. So let's point this out for your notes. When George in 1714 comes to the throne from Germany, he doesn't even speak English. Parliament ostensibly takes over. Let's talk about some other revolutions from your textbook reading on 467. The Industrial Revolution, an explosion of manufacturing involving new technology and new energy sources such as steam, began in the 1700s. Let's write that down. The most important single revolution is going to be what we call the Industrial Revolution, starting in 1700. Powerful new machinery linked with crop rotation, larger farms, and improved transportation led to an agricultural revolution, creating a new abundance with which fewer farmers could feed the swelling population of the cities. The Fourth Revolution began in 1775 and ended in 1781. England, a mighty military power, was defeated by American troops fighting on their own soil. We know of this as the American Revolution, don't we? America became independent but maintained connections of language, politics, culture, and of course literature, why we're studying, right? That enriched both countries. The Fifth Revolution of the period began on July 14th, let's write these dates down, 1789, when the people of Paris stormed the Bastille, a hated symbol of royal oppression. Shortly after this, King Louis XVI was beheaded, and the old order was shattered. Government without kings, already established in America, had now displaced a monarchy in Europe. At the end of the American Revolution, when Lord Cornwallis led his defeated troops out of Yorktown, the band played a popular tune. The world turned upside down. It's a good theme song for the whole era. Let's write that down. The world turned upside down. It is a time of tremendous political unrest. Let's point out the key historical theme, however, Civil War and revolutions. I'm with you now to the heading on 467. 3 bullet points. Let's put it in our own notes. 1. Struggles between king and parliament led to a bloody civil war culminating in the execution of Charles I and subsequently to a bloodless revolution disposing Charles II's successor, James II. Industrial and agricultural revolutions boosted manufacturing and farming production. And finally, revolutions in America and France showed that people could change their form of government. Let's now go to 468 and the essential questions across time. The 17th and 18th centuries again, the question to begin with. What is the relationship between literature and place? Bustling city versus quiet country. That age-old division is central to the period. For most of the time, it is the city of London that matters, but gradually it is the rural landscape that comes to dominate. Question: how was London the capital of literature too? Old London. Heading. Let's keep reading. The London of the 17th century poets John Donne, Ben Jonson, and the young John Milton was still the old city of narrow, unpaved streets and timber houses. The River Thames was the main thoroughfare. It was easier to sail to a distant destination than walk or ride. And with only one bridge, ferries were needed to connect the two banks of the river. During the Civil War and the Protectorate of Cromwell, all eyes focused on the Houses of Parliament. These were not the imposing buildings in which Parliament sits today, made famous by postcards. Those buildings were erected in the 1840s. Although much smaller, they were still the stages on which the political dramas of the day were enacted. In 1660, let's write this date down, a new king returned from exile in London, threw off its Puritan black, reopened the theaters the triumphant Puritans had closed in 1642, welcomed actresses on the stage for the first time, and celebrated. Let's point this out. In Shakespeare's day of 1600, we have no females on stage. You have guys dressed up like girls. So in Romeo and Juliet, Juliet's actually a guy dressed up like a girl. But by 1642, we start to have actually females on the stage. London disasters become London literature. The final heading on 468. The party did not last long, however. The Puritans said it was divine retribution on a scandalous court. Historians say it was flea-bearing rats from the busy wharves on the Thames. In 1664, the plague struck. Let's write that down. 1664, the plague struck. And the streets of London were filled with carts carrying dead bodies to lime pits. Then, in 1666, a great fire broke out, and large areas of London were incinerated. Samuel Pepys captured these twin disasters in his diary, displacing a reporter's cool eye and a citizen's warm concern. Pepys was writing only for himself, or so he thought. The diary, written in code, was translated and published in the 19th century. At least 2 generations later, however, Daniel Defoe interviewed survivors of the plague and studied records to recreate that perilous time for a broad public, writing the fictional A Journal of the Plague Year. Notice your next question. How did roads lead to novels? Just as London was rebuilt after the fire, the countryside was also being transformed by a series of turnpikes for stagecoaches and canals for barges. The primary purpose was business, but as people took advantage of the new mobility the coach roads offered, a new literary form took inspiration from the road, the novel. The novel pictured all kinds of characters and their wanderings. Henry Fielding's humorous and good-natured Tom Jones was a prime example of a novel on the road. One later writer, the French novelist Stendhal, would even define a novel as a mirror traveling down a road, reflecting the life around it. Finally, let's look at the box on page 469, the British tradition, the changing English language. Notice this one. No harmless drudge he. Read it with me. Pay attention. On April 15, 1755, Dr. Samuel Johnson, blind in one eye, impoverished and incompletely educated, produced the first modern dictionary of the English language. Let's write that down. That's an important date. Samuel Johnson's first dictionary, modern dictionary of the English language. Johnson set himself the task of making a different kind of dictionary, one of the first that would include all the words in the English language, not just the difficult ones. In addition, he would show how to divide words into syllables and where words came from. He would establish a consistent system of defining words and draw from his own gigantic learning to provide, for the first time in any dictionary, illustrative quotations from famous writers. Underfunded and working almost alone in a Fleet Street garret room, Johnson defined some 43,000 words and illuminated their meanings with more than 114,000 supporting quotations. Johnson defined a lexicographer as, quote, a writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge. However, end quote, he was obviously far more than a harmless drudge, and his 2-volume dictionary was by far the most comprehensive and readable that had appeared. Notice our next question at the bottom of 469. How did a new gathering place capture a new readership? All roads still led to London, especially for the bright and ambitious in London. They would encounter a new kind of gathering place. Suddenly, top of page 470, like mushrooms sprung up overnight, These places were all over the city. There seemed to be one on every corner. Who could account for the unstoppable spread of the coffee house? Wills and Whites were among the most fashionable, but they all had many regulars. They were popular because they offered not only coffee, the beverage that was all the rage at the time, but a place to hang out, to meet friends, to smoke a pipe, and to read the essays in those newfangled magazines people were talking about. The titles of two famous magazines of the time, the Tatler and the Spectre, suggest that periodicals were an extension of the observation and gossip that took place around the city, and especially in coffee houses. Such gossip, however, was still respectable for a self-conscious and social climbing middle class. A coffee house was more proper than a tavern. So coffee houses for the proper people, bars, taverns for the people who want to just party. Samuel Johnson, who had ridden from Lynchfield to London to seek literary fame and fortune, sharing a horse with future actor David Garrick, according to legend, embodied the London man of letters at this time. He famously remarked that if a man were tired of London, he was tired of life. In his greatest literary achievement, the Dictionary of the English Language, Johnson defined in a single book all the words worth knowing, just as London itself defined all the life worth living. Look at our next question. How did the countryside begin to influence literature? By the way, I hope you paid attention to the three essential vocab questions over on the right-hand side there: mobility, meditative, and urbane. I hope you got all three of those words in your notes as well. How did the countryside begin to influence literature? Even as Johnson was speaking, however, the times were changing. One of the most popular and influential poems of the second half of the 18th century is not set in London, but in a country churchyard, a graveyard. Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard is a sober and thoughtful poem, and its meditative tone is completely different from the biting satire that flourished in an urban world. A mood of nocturnal reverie became the dominant mood of poetry. Removed from the din and dirt of the city, poets looked to country landscapes for inspiration, moral examples, and consolation. The country replaced the city as the setting and subject for literature. Let's look at the top of 471. Question: how does literature shape or reflect society? Let's go to work with it. The turmoil of the period raised profound questions about order. Civil war toppled a king and so posed the question, what holds the social order together? Fueled by religious differences, the war dramatized still other fundamental questions, like this one. If human beliefs differ irreconcilably, what can one know about the order of the world or about the right way to behave? Even economic growth opened questions. Members of the new middle class, their place in the world secured by prosperity, not birth, were haunted by the question, what is my place in the social order? The literature of the time was dedicated to answering such questions. For example, Marx will later raise this question, are you your money? To what degree are you then made up by your economics? The money either you were raised with or without. Notice the next topic. How did Milton's grace become Newton's gravity? For John Milton, who lived through the Civil War, serving as Cromwell's secretary, literature, religion, and civic duty were all related. His epic Paradise Lost takes disobedience as its theme, the rebellious pride of Satan leading to the willful disobedience of Eve. Writing in the dark days when the Puritan religious government had failed, he intended his epic poem to, quote, justify the ways of God to men, end quote. At almost the same time that Milton published Paradise Lost, one of England's towering geniuses provided a different vision of God's ways in the world. In 1687, let's write this date down. In 1687, Isaac Newton published his Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, and everything changed. Newton demonstrated that the universe was governed by natural physical principles. Newton himself was a deep religious man, but others read his work as proof that the world operated without the constant attention of a divine being. Gravity replaced grace. Some believed in a divine watchmaker who created and wound up the universe and then let it tick on its own. Belief in a benevolent but detached God was called deism. Let's get that word in our notes. Deism, the belief in a kind but detached God. Popes Essay on Man tells us, quote, know then thyself, presume not God to scan, end quote. More and more emphasis would be placed on understanding humans in their own world and according to the natural laws of the world. Notice the three essential questions, essential vocab words on 471. Civic, rational, and proportional. Let's go to 472 really quickly. Why did literature focus on conduct? And then I hope you have this word satire written down, and proportion, top of 472. In this new world, writers examined conduct through the lens of reason, not revelation. As a result, satire flourished. Satire ridicules conduct that is not rational, that is out of proportion. Pope's Rape of the Lock is a mock epic in which a trivial incident is treated as something earth-shaking. Swift's Gulliver's Travels is, with its tiny Lilliputians and great Brobdingnags, a study in proportion and the disproportionate things that humans do. The how-to genres. Read it with me, I'm on 472. The literary essay began as a how-to genre, teaching rational conduct to the new Middle Ages and helping them find their own identity. As Addison says in his essay, The Aims of the Spectre, he hopes the, quote, morning lectures, end quote, in his new periodical will provide, quote, instruction agreeable and diversion useful, end quote. The novel also had its start in the how-to fashion. Samuel Richardson, a publisher, wrote a book of advice on conduct for apprentices. He then began a series of model letters on problems of conduct in daily life. In 1740, these turned into Pamela. Often cited as the first English novel, Pamela is epistolatory in form. It's a series of letters by a young servant whose virtue is unsuccessfully assailed by her master. Religious belief was also caught up in this question of appropriate conduct. John